a little disadvantaged that I left Trinidad in Form 2, so I didn't do a lot of Caribbean authors in high school because I came to the States and we were doing all of, you know, almost everything American. So I came to Caribbean authors later. But my absolute favorite, Earl Lovelace. You know, when I found Lovelace, it that as much was one of the corralling factors because it made me feel that it made me see the value in just my own voice as a Trinidadian man, my own voice talking about things that were Trinidadian, and how that fit into anything else. And also even just giving me space to feel like, even though here we have Earl Lovelace, who's Earl Lovelace writing as a straight Trinidadian man, it gave me a power to write as a gay Trinidadian man because it was speaking to being true to self, true being unique to who you are.
The how did I come to influences to me, I kind of separate from the who influence because the who influences to me changes as time goes on. You know what I'm saying? But I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I read a lot as a child. And it's not that I was an only child or anything. I just love words. I remember my father was a sailor in the early part of my life, and he lived, so he'd be out on ships all the time, and he would often, I mean, apart from that, he would write out or read his letters. Whatever port he was in, quite often, he'd send presents, and the presents were often books. I can remember specific books that he would send, you know, I mean, the streets of books and so on. So I think I just kind of got into the word from early that way. There was that kind of connection. And after that, as far as influences goes, to be honest, Reece, it varies at different times. And I think, too, in some ways, musicians, especially jazz musicians, have been as much an influence as writers.
Yes.
Okay, well, in terms of poetry, I mean, there's an American poet called C.K. Williams, who I've always been fascinated with. Partly is the fact that he uses these long lines, which I find myself really drawn toward. You know, so there are officers that are kind of like perennial influences, like like Blake and Martin Carter, the people like that.
Yeah.
But in terms of like right now, I'd say probably C.K. Williams is someone who I'm really kind of watching.
Important thing to writing, which I think a lot of people don't get, is reading.
Yeah.
I cannot read a bad novel and start writing. I mean, when I'm in the middle of a good novel like a Dickens or a Pynchon, then it's just like having a good push off.
Yeah.
You know, and your mind, your perceptual apparatus is attuned to a really good, the way a good writer uses language, and it's not even on a conscious level, where the way he arranges words, that kind of imprints at a, I think, subconscious, unconscious, anyway, not conscious level.
Yeah.
And you find yourself kind of taking off from that and improvising on that. But when you read a bad writer, then everything you write starts to sound like the bad writer. So avoid bad writers. Different points in the career, different writers have done. Walcott as a poet. I'm talking about initial.
Yeah.
Who was a novelist? I guess. No. As a fiction writer, that came late. Thomas Pynchon. To me, is just the king. I love him. And fiction writers, Don DeLillo is good. Philip Roth is good. Again, Dickens is great. There's this Franz Kafka. I quite like Kafka for a little while, just for the point of view. There's this great book called A Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil. It's a German-Austrian book translated into English. Good, right? Yeah, these are some of the people who've influenced me. The Man Without Qualities was an enormous influence. And that's just a 1,200-page book about a guy who just stands around thinking all day.
Yeah.
You know, he does things, but like he's in the middle of a fight and he's getting beat up and he's saying, isn't it amazing how hostility just floats in the atmosphere like a chloroform compound affecting those nervous systems, and the guys are kicking his ass. So, you know, it's I quite like that influenced me a lot. It's also a book of ideas, which, you know, movies, you know, visual culture is very, movies are very stimulating. Very, Quentin Tarantino. I'm not really up too much on movie makers nor documentary films. The point with being a writer is to just increase your store of knowledge and experience in as many directions as possible, and it feeds your writing. Literally feeds it.
Well, I grew up in the 60s, you know, so it meant that by the time when I went to school, I went to school in the 70s, I guess. I was born in the 60s, late 60s. I went to school in the 70s, so all the books I read, all the literature books were Caribbean you know, all the stories I read were by Caribbean writers, and so I feel really lucky in that way. And so I grew up on all of them. V.S. Naipaul, Lemming, Salke, Louise Bennett, and then later, when I went to college, I read everybody I could get my hands on because I was so homesick. So Michelle Cliff, Audre Lorde, Erna Broadbent, you know, everybody.
Presently, I'm reading a lot of Louise Bennett's work, mainly for enjoyment, but really for the use of language, because she, her collection and just the ethos of her work has been a big inspiration to me. I was always aware of her work anyway from a child because my grandfather would recite some of her work anyway, and it was a name that was called quite frequently in the house through her folk songs and things like that. But also I recently started reading some works of Claude McKay, who, from what I understand, was probably one of the first Jamaicans to inscribe his work in patois. And we're going back to like 1903, his work was published in the Jamaican Gleaner. So I'm really reading a lot of his work and who he was and what he stands for and the fact that he came to England. But also, in terms of inspiration, I mean, Camel Braithwaite, I love his work and very inspired by the rhythm and aesthetics of his work. Equally to that, I'm very inspired by the works of Linton Kwesi Johnson. You know, I've had the pleasure of performing
the dub poetry
poetry.
yeah.
And I was raised on sound system music, you know, on reggae music and ska. So listening to people like U-Roy and I-Roy and Big U from a small age, them toasting over the dub version of music, and then going to sound clash dances and listening to the Toasters. And I would say probably that was, I didn't recognise I was really interested in that. I just wanted to get on the mic and imitate the man them. You know, and I used to kind of take their lyrics rather than write my own. And someone said, stop taking my lyrics, you know, you got to write your own, you got to write your own. So I was quite young when that was happening and I didn't really take that serious. But as I got older, I started to realise that they're poets. You know, they're dub poets, and I can see where Linton Kwesi Johnson would have developed that style, that influence, you know, and the fact that Jamaica is a nation of orators and a radio culture, you know, and the fact that they, you know, they've got a way with words.
Absolutely.
You have to be intrigued by this patois language, this use of language, you know. So going back to Louise Bennett, I'm really interested in the aesthetics of her work and the style in which she was writing in.